All right. Well, then I am very pleased to be able to introduce our guest teacher tonight. Really, I'm just bubbling over. So I'm going to read Booker's introduction and then pass the evening over to you, Booker. So Booker brings her heart and wisdom to the intersection of Dharma, embodied wisdom, and liberation. Using this framework, she supports folks in being a part of a culture of belonging by changing the paradigm of self and community care. Booker has spoken at Mind and Life Institute's International Symposium, Contemplative Minds in Higher Education, Mindfulness in America, and Mindfulness in Education conferences, along with other leaders. Booker has been a featured speaker at the Fetzer Institute, Vassar and Pitzer Colleges, and the Contemplative Sciences Center here at UVA. She's especially passionate about supporting the sustainability of folks on the front lines and training future mindfulness and classroom teachers. Booker learned to center the heart and the importance of cultivating relationships when she began sharing the practices of yoga and mindfulness with incarcerated and vulnerable populations in New York City 2 decades ago. She served as a senior teacher and director of teacher trainings with Lineage Project for 10 years and facilitated a mindfulness and cognitive-based therapy intervention with the Lionheart Foundation on Rikers Island for 2 years, a partnership between NYU and the National Institute of Health. She also supported the efforts of the beloved Charlotte's Place in Lower Manhattan in their vision of an interfaith community space rooted in radical hospitality. She is co-founder of the Yoga Service Council at Omega Institute and the Meditation Working Group of Occupy Wall Street. She is a co-author of Best Practices for Yoga in a Criminal Justice Setting, a contributor to Georgetown Law Center's Poverty and Inequality Report, Gender and Trauma, Somatic Interventions for Girls in Juvenile Justice, Yoga, The Secret of Life, contributed to Sharon Salzberg's book, Happiness at Work, and Black Buddhists and the Black Radical Tradition by Dr. Rima Vesely-Flawed. She is a graduate of Spirit Rock's Mindful Yoga and Meditation Training, Community Dharma Leaders Training, and their 4-year retreat training, teacher training. In 2020, she was invited to be a Sojourner Truth Leadership Fellow through Auburn Seminary and was voted by her peers as one of the 12 powerful women in the mindfulness movement. Booker, thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and it is yours.
Thank you so much, Liz. I always forget who has which bio, and so I felt myself being like, oh, it's the long one, and kind of like cringing as you were reading. So thank you so much. Hello, Charlottesville. I love that we are doing a hybrid model this evening, so I want to say special hello to the folks who are in person at a church. Hello. And hello to each and every one of you who have joined us on Zoom today. So for those of you who are new friends, my name is Booker. My pronouns are she and her, and I live and rest and am protected by the land that was stewarded so beautifully by the Lenape people in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I've been living for about 2 years. But my lineage, what we call my old home place, is actually in Ivy, Virginia. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and my family on my mother's side has been on Old Turner Mountain Lane Road in Ivy, Virginia for like 4 or 5 generations. And that's where my parents retired and live. And for those of you who don't know, Old Turner Mountain Lane Road was initially inhabited by formerly enslaved folks exclusively. And my family is the last remaining Black family there. So I feel a very strong connection to Charlottesville, to Ivy, to the beautiful red clay that used to stain my socks when I was a kid, visiting my grandparents. So coming in teaching in Charlottesville feels like a homecoming. So thank you so much for having me this evening. I always like to bring in my ancestors from the land of Ivy, and also my ancestors and the Dharma, my ancestors of liberation. And so the ancestor of the Dharma that really inspires the way I teach is Dipa Ma. Dipa Ma, translated as the mother of Dipa. And she was a householder, widowed soon after her baby was born, and was dying of a broken heart. And she was in Bangladesh, and her doctor recommended that she meditated. And so she was one who really inspired other women to be able to wake up, to find their spiritual practice while they were householders. Told them that they didn't need to go off into the forest and meditate, but that they could wake up, they could have full liberation through their everyday task as housewives, as householders. And so her style of sort of taking the practice off the cushion and just, I don't want to say ingest, but living the practice off the cushion and finding liberation in any form that you're in is such a huge inspiration to me and the way that I offer my teachings. My ancestors of liberation are people like the poet, activist, writer Audre Lorde, the Zen monastic and founder of Engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, the social commentator and academic, beautiful writer, Bell Hooks. So these are people that I am inviting in, whose shoulders I stand on to be here this evening to share these offerings with you. So Liz invited me to come in and speak on right livelihood today. And I said, yay, because I didn't have to decide what I wanted to teach on. It was really like so liberating to just be handed an assignment and be like, cool, I can do that. So I'm really excited to jump into that conversation this evening with you all. So, as we're talking about right livelihood or skillful livelihood, I find that whatever teachings we are offering, for me, always starts with the felt sense of the body. It always starts with what we can know, what we can feel through dropping into the information, the messages that our body gives us, and also dropping into the quality of the breath. So whether the breath is short and tight or flowing freely, so much information that we need to know can be found by tapping into the body. And so I invite us to take a moment to find a posture that's going to work for our body this evening. If you've had a long day and you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders and you need the earth to witness you and to hold you, you can take a lying down practice. If there is a lot of restlessness or energy, buzziness moving through the body, a standing practice. Actually, that could be a walking practice would be better for you. If there's sleepiness in the body, standing could be really great because we don't typically fall asleep when we're standing up. So if you're feeling really sleepy, standing could be a really beautiful practice for you to explore this evening. And if you're sitting on the cushion, on your bed, on the couch, on a chair, you want to make sure that your posture is alert. There's like a softening, but you're also upright. So we can have a strong back. So the skeleton is holding our body upright, but also holding a soft belly at the same time. If you're sitting on a cushion or on a couch, you might want to sit at the tip of it so that your pelvic bone can tilt forward. And that can allow the natural curve of your spine to arise so that we can depend on the skeleton to hold our bodies up instead of muscling with gripping our bodies. So we want to be able to create a form and shape of the body that brings ease and comfort, because when a body is at ease, then a mind can be at ease. I always like to take a moment to look around my space. Even though I've been in this room all day, it's still nice to sort of reorient myself to the space, noticing colors and shapes, noticing the elements of nature, noticing how much space is above me, to the east and to the west of me, from side to side, and the north and the south. And so also feeling into the depth of my experience of what is in front of me as well as what is behind me. So allowing myself to know, to feel the spaciousness around me allows me to know the spaciousness within me. So I invite you to go ahead and rest your eyes in whatever way works best for you this evening. For some folks, resting the eyes might mean to keep the eyes open, but holding a soft focus. So we're not really seeing things clearly. We're just kind of seeing a fuzzy framework, which is why I'm taking my glasses off, so I actually can't see things very clearly right now. You can rest the eyes by looking down to the tip of the nose or a spot on the earth. Or you can close the eyes by allowing the top lid to gently kiss the bottom lid as we close the eyes all together. And as we begin to arrive in our practice, as we begin to shed the busyness of our day, or rushing if we got caught in traffic on our way to being in person, if we hurry to put some dinner into our mouths before the call, you can take a moment to rest in the fact that we've arrived, that we're here, and that we are being witnessed and able to witness those who have come to share practice with us this evening. So begin by dropping in to the body. I just start with the root, so starting with my feet first. Kind of checking in with where the feet are. You can wiggle the toes. If you're sitting or standing, you might want to lift the toes, spread them wide, and then place them back down onto the earth. And then perhaps lifting the heels, feeling them sort of energetically spreading, and then dropping them back down to the earth. And so knowing the arches of our feet and our ankles. Noticing the space between our ankles and our kneecaps. I like to flex my calf muscles just to remind me of this lower part of my leg and where it is in space. Feeling into the weight of the femur, the biggest bone in our body that is between our kneecaps and our hip joints. Noticing how they hook into our hips and into our pelvic bone, that heavy bone that sits in the middle of our body, connecting the bottom to the top of our body. If you're sitting upright, it could be useful to kind of explore the sits bone, the bottom of our pelvic bone, by perhaps leaning forward or leaning back, leaning to the right and to the left. If you're lying down, you can tip the pelvic bone up and back. If you're lying down, see if you can rest by bringing your sacrum to the ground, that triangle bone at the base of your spine. That can be easily accessed by bending your knees, placing the feet on the ground, and really pressing the low back into the earth to give you some ground and a way to have contact with the earth while lying down. Feeling the length of your spine, perhaps slightly tucking the chin so we can feel the spine from the tailbone all the way up to the middle of the back of our skull. Feeling the collarbones widen and the shoulders slide away from the ears as we bring some weight to our elbows. And noticing that space between the elbows and the wrist and the tops and the palms of our hands and down to the tips of our fingers. And so feeling into the stillness of this body at rest. Feeling into the qualities of the earth body. Heavy, grounding, stillness. And in the stillness, you might notice that there is a expansion and contraction, a rising and falling, as wind element is known in this body, as we breathe the breath in and as we breathe the breath out. And see how low you can drop the breath into your body, perhaps starting with bringing the hands over the belly. And as you breathe in, feeling the hands sort of separate and expand as the breath breathes in, pressing the belly into the palms of our hands. And as we breathe the breath out, see if we can feel the hands slide back together as the breath sends the belly button back towards our spine. So breathing the breath in through the center of our body and breathing the breath back out. The next time you breathe the breath out, see if you can press the breath out through the distal planes of the body, so out through the fingertips, the crown of the head, the bottoms of the feet. See how much movement we can explore with wind element moving through the body. Noticing if there's any tightness or contraction in the body. I tend to clench my glutes and kind of clench my upper thighs when I sit. So I'm constantly checking in to make sure that they are open and released. So I'm not holding any tension in my body, so that my mind can follow suit and create a sense of openness and spaciousness in its mind. So as I mentioned, we'll be working with this first bucket in the Eightfold Path, Sila, specifically looking at right livelihood this evening. And so notice the initial response in the body. Was there a tightness, a contraction, even an aversion, a leaning back around this topic? So there's nothing to do, but just notice whatever is arising. Maybe there's a leaning in as we're grasping, clinging, wanting to know more about this. So just noticing where you are, where the body is, the quality of the breath as it responds. And see if you can touch back in to that quality of ease in the body, the openness of the heart, the fluidity of breath as we breathe in through the center and breathe out through the distal. And so one of the intentions of our practice isn't to, I'm not going to say what it isn't, but I will say what it is. And that is sati, right? To remember, to recollect, to come back home again. So when the mind begins to wander, to worry, to plan, to overthink, when we recognize that the mind has wandered and we remember to come back to the felt sense of this body resting on the earth, that is the practice. So sati, to remember, to come back to recollect, to come back to the anchor, whether that be the stillness of body, the quality of breath, sound, taste, touch. Allowing ourselves to come back home again. If the mind has wandered and have moved into a mind that is planning or thinking, can we drop back to the felt sense of this body? Earth element resting on earth element. Wind element breathing itself in and breathing itself back out again. Thank you so much for your practice, dear ones. So for a lot of us, I think it's complicated to figure out how to live our practice off the cushion. We've learned how to meditate, which means we've learned how to find our anchor and come back to the body or breath. We understand that hindrances can also be portals towards our wisdom and not a thing to turn away from. We might have even found a posture that's bearable for us to rest in for a considerable amount of time. But the question I get from students who come to me for mentoring is, but how do I do this in real time? How do I practice when I'm not on the cushion, when I'm not on retreat? Many of us can gain a lot of clarity and can come into clear view, clear understanding after we meditate. That stillness of mind that we can cultivate in our formal practice can be incredibly supportive in helping us to see things right-sized and to prioritize what's truly important and to let go of what's in the way. But how do we get to that clarity in real time? It's not always appropriate when your boss is asking you a question about the budget to sit down, close your eyes, and go inwards for 30 minutes. If you did that every time someone asked you to, something at work, we'd have a lot of clarity and discernment, true, but it's also might not be the best technique when we have a job that relies on deadlines and actually moving things ahead. So early in my practice, I created the opportunity for myself to travel to Uganda to sit a personal retreat with Bhante Buddharikita. And for those of you who don't know Bhante, he's just an incredible monastic in the Theravada tradition. He was born and raised in Uganda and just one of the most extraordinary humans I've ever met. So after my first retreat, he invited people to come to Uganda to sit at the Uganda Buddhist Center, which he was in the process of building. And I jumped on that opportunity, and 6 months later, I was in Uganda with him. And at the end of my time there, I realized that I was coming back to New York City in the dead of winter. I had given up my job. I had spent most of my money to buy the ticket to get there. And I didn't really have a plan of what my life was going to look like post-retreat with Bhante. And so I asked him for advice to, what do I do? How do I go back to New York, and how do I continue my practice the way that I have been exploring it there? And what he said to me was, your life has to be your practice, and your practice has to be your life. There can be no separation. And at the time, I thought, damn, that's some really bad advice. I think somebody's unmuted. I can hear someone speaking. And so even though at the time I was like, this is horrible advice, I also knew that there was something about this. That this was like a golden nugget of wisdom that I should really hold on to. And as my practice deepened, I knew that I would figure it out along the way. And so when I came back to New York in February with no money and no job, I decided that I really wanted to know my practice off the cushion. I really wanted to see if this practice was real. And I followed the advice of the Buddha, who said, "Ehipassiko, come and see for yourself." And so I thought I would spend a year practicing the Eightfold Path, which I know that you all have been practicing and working with right now. And so I thought, if I can live the Eightfold Path off the cushion, then this practice is real and I'm going to stick to it. And so as a reminder, the Eightfold Path is sort of split into 3 different buckets. The first one is Sila, which is our moral virtue, and that includes skillful speech, skillful action, skillful livelihood. That second bucket is Samadhi, which is concentration. So we're looking at skillful effort, skillful mindfulness, skillful concentration. So really collecting the mind in that one. Excuse me. Then the third bucket is our wisdom bucket, Panya, and that includes right view and right resolve. And so I began at the beginning. I started with Sila. And it was really this first bucket that energized me, because it showed me how deeply our lives were intertwined as I explored the 5 precepts of right action, how to express myself in a way that could be heard by learning how to listen with my heart through the tenets of right speech, and how to keep my practice alive and at the forefront as I explored how to keep my values aligned within my livelihood. So this bucket of Sila also shows up as a second aspect of the paramis, these 10 perfections of heart and mind that are the prequel to the Buddha's life. And here, Sila is rooted in the heart. So these ethical guidelines of how we move through the world and take care of ourselves, each other, and our earth are said to be a gift to the world. And one of these gifts is the ability to be in relationship and to touch one another's lives. And that is really a revolutionary act. In the poem, When I Die by Nikki Giovanni, she says, "And if I touched a life, I hope that life knows that I know that touching was and still is and will always be the true revolution." And so Sila lays the groundwork that allows us to touch another life as we make sure that the heart and mind are attuned to skillful speech, skillful action, and skillful livelihood, so that we don't harm each other and we don't harm ourselves as we navigate the world. And it was Bante, when I was in Uganda and we were talking about the Eightfold Path, and he was like, "I don't like the word right. When you say right, it sounds like if you're not doing it well, then you're wrong." And he said, "I like skillfulness or skillful," because he said that it gives you space to sort of grow into this, to build up the skill or the capacity. So even though typically we'll say right livelihood, I really love skillful livelihood. And so, this foundation of Sila, these 3 buckets are the soil, and from it, the rest of the path can reveal itself and bloom out of it. So in comparison to a lot of the other teachings of the Buddha, there isn't a lot written about skillful livelihood. And I think that is because social media didn't exist when the Buddha was teaching about skillful livelihood. People's, lives and what they did for a living were pretty simple and straightforward. And so this is from the Anguttara Nikaya. He says, "A lay follower," so meaning people who are non-monastic, so us, lay practitioners. So a lay follower should not engage in 5 types of business. Which 5? business in weapons. So selling guns, utilizing guns, having anything to do with anything that can be weaponized. The business in human beings. So this is, sex trafficking, and any other way that we utilize and we harm human beings. Business in meat. And so there's a myth that the Buddha was a vegetarian and that he promotes vegetarianism, which is not true. But what he said is that an animal should only be butchered for the explicit use of feeding people. And so even though he had a pretty much plant-based diet, but his whole thing was he would eat meat if it was an offering, but he wouldn't eat meat if it was explicitly butchered on his behalf. So I think that's a really interesting discernment. And ironically, he actually died of pork poisoning, from what I understand. He died from being poisoned by pork that wasn't fully cooked. Sidebar. The business in intoxicants and the business in poison. And so in intoxicants, we're not just talking about things like drugs and alcohol, but intoxicant is anything that can cloud our heart and mind and have us to kind of respond and act outside of ourselves. And then good poisons is speaking directly to things like alcohol, something that can, so he speaks of the business of poison. So selling in alcohol, selling drugs. So these are the 5 types of businesses that we shouldn't engage in when we're talking about skillful livelihood. And for monks and contemplatives, the Digha Nikaya says that they should steer clear of fortune telling, of blood sacrifices, and other base or lowly arts. The careers of a soldier and actor, I think, are kind of ironically conflated. He's like soldiers and actors, same people. And so they're saying that, that these careers are dangerous to the soul because in the Samyutta Nikaya, it says that it requires us to act outside of ourselves. As a soldier brings the intention of harm to another, and as actors, they have to cultivate the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, which might not be the true quality of their hearts. And so this can lead to an intoxication and heedlessness that can cloud the heart and mind, which I want to remind you is the 5th of the 5 precepts when we talk about skillful action. So this is pretty straightforward and probably makes sense for most of us. But even the good work that we're doing in the world can get us tangled up in the delusion of a livelihood that ultimately can create harm to others. So in Pali, the language that the Buddha's teachings were translated in, because this was it was an oral tradition for anywhere from 100 to 500 years, and then was written down about 500 years after the Buddha's death. And so the language that his teachings were translated into after being an oral lineage for that long was Pali, because it was sort of like the language of the people. It's an accessible language. And so the prefix Samma in Samma Ajiva is the Pali word for right livelihood or skillful livelihood. So the prefix Samma, S-A-M-M-A, means complete, perfected, as opposed to simply meaning right. So something that's complete or perfected means that there's a little bit more depth and effort, and it speaks to me like more of like a journey to get there, as opposed to something being right or wrong, right? So I just want to bring out the Pali so we have a deeper understanding of what we're talking about here. And so Samma Ajiva may mean something closer to livelihood fully understood and rightfully conducted with all of its tensions. And that says a lot more, right? It gives me a lot more to think about, to contemplate as I'm looking at what I'm doing for a living. So I thought that I had the best livelihood in the world. For over a decade, I shared the practices of yoga and mindfulness to vulnerable populations. Mostly for 10 years, I worked in jails teaching yoga and mindfulness to incarcerated youth. Also spending 2 years on Rikers Island. For those of you who are familiar with Rikers, it's one of the most notoriously violent city jails in New York City. But it's the most notoriously violent city jail in the country. It's a really horrific place to be. And I was there for 2 years, also working with the adolescent population that were young boys that were 16 to 18. Many of them were at the beginning of their life sentences. And this was work that I loved so deeply, and I was so dedicated and so devoted to it. And I very much identify with being, that prison girl. And I know I spoke at conferences and traveled around the country and taught trainings for a long time. And it began to feel strange for me. And I couldn't understand why. I had written academic papers about the work I was doing. I had co-written books about the work I was doing. And yet somewhere like 8, 9 years in, the work was no longer sitting well with me. Part of that was I went to South Africa to sit a month-long retreat with Tanessa and Kitty Sorrow, doing really devotional heart practices rooted in compassion. So a lot of devotional practices to Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And after a month of prostrations and waking up at 5 a.m. and chanting and bowing, something shifted in me, something woke up, and I had this clear understanding of the work that I was doing. And even though I truly felt and believed that I was supporting these young folks in finding their wings when their wings have been clipped by society, I also began to see the other side, that my presence was validating locking children up in jail. Because what was happening is these jails and prisons across the country were getting huge amounts of money, because they could say, look, they've got yoga, they've got meditation, they've got art, they've got music. It's like summer camp here. But it wasn't. I was caught up in the delusion. I couldn't see clearly what was really happening. And what was happening is that they were utilizing these children to fund other programs. Like, very little of this money was actually going to the work that we were doing in there. And by saying, look at all the great work we're doing, it justified prisons being open. It justified them being further financed. It justified them taking away dignity of these young people, and a lot of their ability to have a space of rehabilitation and to enter back into the world. And there was this internal agitation in my body as I began to fully understand and could feel into all the tensions of the work that I was doing. And I realized that I couldn't go back anymore. And, for those of us who are doing, that sort of work, maybe you can balance it out, and I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, how it landed for me. And something that really supported me in getting there was leaning on the precepts, right? Because a lot of these teachings only come alive when they're in relationship with other teachings that kind of support and lift them up and give them legs. And so for me to lean on the precepts, I was able to reflect on if this work was protecting life. Was the work I was doing protecting life? Was there a generosity of heart and mind? Was there any kind of power dynamic at play that my presence kind of co-signed? Was the language that folks were using or not using aligned with my values? And was I being intoxicated by money or prestige of my positionality in the world? And so we can fall back on the precepts, right? Knowing how deeply our lives are intertwined, we can check in to see if we are protecting life, if we are being generous, if we are caring for our sexual energy, which I often say to me is very similar to power dynamics, right? So what power are we holding over when we are being intoxicated by that? What is the language that we are using? And I find that so many people would use this sort of manipulative language to speak about what we were doing. And we were actually just kind of, and sometimes I felt that people were using mindfulness to silence or to still these young people. And then checking in with the intoxicants, was my heart and mind being clouded by these things? And so, moving back to the Buddha's teachings, this is from the Majjhima Nikaya. He says, "And how is right view the forerunner? One discerns wrong livelihood as wrong livelihood, and right livelihood as right livelihood. And what is wrong livelihood? Scheming, persuading, hinting, belittling, and pursuing gain with gain. So this is wrong livelihood. One tries to abandon wrong livelihood and to enter into right livelihood. And this is one's right effort. One is mindful to abandon wrong livelihood and to enter and remain in right livelihood. And this is one's right mindfulness. So thus, these three qualities of right view, right effort, right mindfulness run and circle around right livelihood. So we lean on these teachings, the other part of the bucket of sila, we lean on the precepts, and then we also lean on the buckets of panya and samadhi when we're looking at right view, right effort, right mindfulness, right effort. So you see how this is all kind of circles around and swirls around and really supports and lifts up these teachings. I also love that right livelihood is connected to how we spend our money, how we utilize our money. And so it said, a householder knowing his income and expenses leads a balanced life, neither extravagant nor miserly, knowing that thus their income will stand in excess of their expenses, but not their expenses in excess of their income. That's complicated language, but what they're trying to say is, we're really working with livelihood. We're also looking at if we are spending more than we have. Are we being caught up in the delusion of social media? Are we getting caught up in the delusion of what we're seeing out there in the world? Are we spending above our means? And the Buddha speaks to that as being another way of being in wrong livelihood or misdirected or unskillful livelihood. And it also looks at all of the other aspects that supports our livelihood, including the clean water that most of us have access to that makes our coffee and washes our body, the gas that fuels our car and cooks our food, the electricity that warms our bodies, the clothes that we put on our backs, that plastic that wraps our food? Are we looking at where that is coming from, where our waste goes to? Are we looking at where we are spending our money? Are we looking at how we are wasteful with our limited resources on this planet? When we are noticing that eggs are currently not available, are going for $8 a dozen right now, are we looking at what poisons have contaminated these eggs to have, toxic eggs, and what are these poisons that we're sprinkling on our food, right? And so once we really dive into this, we really expand out and we see not only how we are living our livelihood, our intentions around our livelihood, we're also looking at how we spend our money, how we are utilizing our resources, and making sure that we are putting the our income, the end game of our livelihood. Are we investing it into a world that we want to support and live in? And are we explicitly divesting it from organizations, stores that are poisoning the world that we live in? So, dear ones, I offered a lot of words this evening, and I feel that Dharma talks are never complete, even though I so deeply appreciate you listening to the Dharma, listening to my ramblings and how I'm hearing it. I feel like these talks are not really complete until we hear from the wisdom of the room. And so I want to take a moment of silence, because I know that for me, it takes me a minute to kind of digest things. So maybe we take about a minute or two to sit with some questions, or to sit with anything that awakened in your heart or pinged your gut as you were listening to the talk. I'm wondering if livelihood, I'm just wondering how it's landing for you, if there is questions around your livelihood, around any of the Buddhist teachings around it. And also, how do you know when you are in a skillful livelihood and when you're in an unskillful livelihood? This could be the felt sense in the body. It could look like the dragging yourself out of bed because you don't want to go to work in the morning. It could be this sense of just this internal agitation. Yeah, so it'll take you a minute or two to reflect on livelihood and what this looks like for you. It could be useful for you to sit in quiet contemplation, to journal, or to actually get up and move the body to allow these teachings to move through you.